What would you do if the system was against you and all you had was your truth? For one mother and her brave young child in Atlanta, a desperate courtroom plea changed everything. When an 8-year-old girl told a judge, "We're hungry," the entire courtroom was left in shock. What happened next will leave you speechless. Let us know where you're watching from today. And if this powerful story of resilience and honesty resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more inspiring stories that show how courage and compassion can change lives. The early morning sunlight peeked through the thin curtains in Breonna Taylor's small apartment on the west side of Atlanta. This wasn't just any ordinary morning. It was one filled with tension, worry, and the weight of responsibility. But nothing could have prepared her for the storm that was brewing. The small space, which served as both a home and a reminder of her daily struggles, carried the marks of sacrifice. The living room doubled as the dining room, and in one corner her 8-year-old daughter, Grace, scribbled in her homework notebook. Brianna had always done her best to keep the space tidy, despite their limited means. The second-hand couch was threadbare, and the mismatched chairs had seen better days. But the worn items weren't just furniture. They were trophies of perseverance, pieces she'd fought hard to keep while juggling 2 jobs, raising her daughter alone, and scraping by in Atlanta's bustling, unforgiving streets. Today was no different. Brianna glanced at the clock, her heart sinking. It was barely 6 a.m., but she was already behind schedule. Tying her worn-out sneakers, she whispered a quick prayer. Please let today be better. She didn't have the time or the money for anything to go wrong. "Grace, come on, baby, we're going to be late," Brianna called, her voice laced with urgency. "I'm coming, Mama!" Grace's voice rang out from the small bedroom they shared. She emerged clutching her worn-out Barbie backpack, her face lit with excitement. "Look, Mama, I fixed the strap," she said proudly, showing her the makeshift tape job she'd done to her backpack. Brianna forced a smile, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Good job, sweetie. Now let's get moving." They stepped out into the cool Atlanta morning, the sounds of the bustling city already waking up around them. The distant hum of traffic on I-285 mixed with the chatter of neighbors heading to their own jobs. Brianna's old car sat waiting for them in the parking lot, a 15-year-old sedan that had been her lifeline for the past 3 years. The car was falling apart, but it was all she had to navigate her 2 jobs and Grace's school runs. But today, even her car seemed to conspire against her. "Come on, not today," Brianna muttered under her breath as she turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed and sputtered but refused to start. She tried again, her heart sinking with each failed attempt. "Mama, is the car sick?" Grace asked, her big brown eyes filled with concern. Brianna sighed, keeping her frustration in check. "Yeah, baby. It's just a little tired. But don't worry, we'll figure it out." "Can I help?" Grace offered, her small hands already reaching for the dashboard like she could magically fix it. Brianna smiled despite the stress. "I wish you could, sweetie, but it's okay. We'll just have to walk today." Grabbing Grace's hand, Brianna set off down the sidewalk. The morning air was crisp, and the streets were alive with the sounds of Atlanta. A mix of cars honking, bus engines rumbling, and people hurrying to start their days. The walk to Grace's school was about a mile, but for Brianna, it felt like a marathon. Her thoughts raced as she calculated how much time she had before her shift at the diner. She had already been late twice this month, and her boss had made it clear that she couldn't afford a third strike. By the time they reached Grace's school, Brianna's legs ached, but she plastered on a smile as she bent down to hug her goodbye. "Be good today, okay?" she said, kissing her forehead. "I will, Mama. Love you," Grace called as she dashed into the building, her backpack bouncing with each step. Brianna watched her go, her heart swelling with pride and worry. Grace was her world, her reason for pushing through every challenge. But as she turned to head to the diner, a pang of guilt hit her. She hadn't had time to pack her a proper lunch today. Just a sandwich and an apple. She prayed it would be enough. Brianna arrived at the diner 15 minutes late, her cheeks flushed from the hurried walk. The smell of coffee and frying bacon greeted her as she pushed through the door. "You're late again, Brianna," her manager, a burly man named Carl, said without looking up from the counter. "I'm so sorry, Carl. The car wouldn't start this morning," Brianna explained, tying on her apron. Carl grunted, clearly unimpressed. "Just don't let it happen again." "Yes, sir," Brianna replied, her voice meek. She couldn't afford to lose this job. The morning rush was in full swing, and Brianna barely had a moment to catch her breath as she juggled orders, refilled coffee cups, and dealt with impatient customers. By the time her shift ended, her feet throbbed and her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten all day. But there was no time to rest. Her second job as a cleaner downtown started in 2 hours, and she still needed to pick up Grace from school. Brianna stopped by a nearby gas station to grab a cheap snack, a bag of chips and a bottle of water, before heading back to the school. When she arrived, Grace was waiting on the steps, chatting animatedly with one of her classmates. Her face lit up when she saw her. "Hey, Mama, look what I made," he said, holding up a crumpled piece of paper with a drawing of them holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Brianna's exhaustion melted away as she admired the picture. "It's beautiful, baby. I'm going to hang it on the fridge when we get home." Grace beamed, slipping her hand into hers as they walked back to the car. But as they approached, Brianna's heart sank. A bright orange ticket was tucked under the windshield wiper. She grabbed it, her hands trembling as she read the fine: $400 for parking in a no parking zone. "No, no, no," Brianna whispered, the weight of the fine crashing down on her. She felt tears prick her eyes, but quickly wiped them away. "What's wrong, Mama?" Grace asked, sensing her distress. "Nothing, baby. Don't worry about it," Brianna said, forcing a smile. But inside, her mind was racing. $400 was more than she could afford. It was the equivalent of groceries for 2 weeks, or nearly half her rent. How could she possibly pay it? That evening, as Brianna cooked dinner, ramen noodles and canned green beans, her thoughts were consumed by the ticket. Should she try to fight it in court? The idea terrified her. She'd never been to court before, and the thought of standing before a judge made her stomach churn. What choice did she have? After dinner, Brianna tucked Grace into bed. As she pulled the blanket up to her chin, she looked at her with those big, curious eyes. "Mama, are we gonna be okay?" she asked softly. Brianna's heart ached at the question. She stroked her hair and kissed her forehead. "Of course we are, baby. We always are." But as she turned off the light and closed the door, the weight of her words settled heavily on her. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the ticket, the faint sounds of Atlanta's nightlife drifting through the window. The decision loomed over her like a storm cloud. She could barely afford groceries and rent, let alone a court fine. But maybe, just maybe, if she explained her situation to the judge, there might be a sliver of hope. For Brianna, hope was all she had left. Court day and the unexpected outburst. The morning of the court hearing arrived faster than Brianna had anticipated. She hadn't slept much the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, thoughts of the courtroom haunted her. What if the judge dismissed her entirely? What if he doubled the fine? Brianna had heard horror stories about how unforgiving the system could be, especially for people like her. People who were struggling to stay afloat in a city that often felt indifferent to their plight. She sat at the small kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands as she stared at the orange ticket. It felt like a cruel reminder of how close to the edge she was. Across the room, Grace was humming to herself, drawing flowers in a notebook. "Grace," Brianna called softly, trying to keep the anxiety out of her voice. "Come on, baby." We need to get ready. Brianna laid out the best outfit she could find in her small closet, a modest navy dress she had picked up from a thrift store years ago. It was clean and pressed, but the hem was slightly frayed. She hoped it would make her look respectable enough. For Grace, she chose a red gown that was just a little too short. "You look pretty, Grace," she said with a smile as she adjusted her collar. "Do I look like a lawyer, Mama?" she asked, puffing out her chest. Brianna laughed lightly, her tension easing just a little. "Almost. Maybe one day you'll be a real lawyer and help people like me." "I'll be the best lawyer ever," Grace declared with confidence. Brianna's heart ached with pride and fear. She didn't want Grace to see how worried she was. The drive to the courthouse was quiet. Brianna clutched the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she navigated through downtown Atlanta's busy streets. The towering buildings loomed over her, making her feel small and out of place. When they arrived, she parked in a nearby lot and paid the fee with shaking hands. The money she spent on parking only deepened her anxiety. Every dollar counted, and she was already stretched too thin. "Stay close to me, Grace," she said as they approached the courthouse. The building was intimidating with its high columns and cold stone walls. Security guards stood by the entrance, their stern expressions adding to the weight Brianna felt pressing down on her chest. After passing through the metal detectors, Brianna and Grace entered the courtroom. It was larger than she had imagined, with rows of wooden benches and a raised bench where the judge presided. The air was heavy with the murmurs of other defendants waiting for their cases to be heard. Brianna chose a seat near the back, pulling Grace close to her. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the other people who had come to plead their cases. There were young men in hoodies, older women clutching purses, and even a man in a suit who looked completely out of place. Her attention was drawn to the judge. Judge Marcus Evans sat behind a massive wooden bench, his expression stern and unreadable. His reputation for being strict preceded him, and Brianna felt her stomach twist in knots. "Is that the judge, Mama?" Grace whispered, her eyes wide as she looked at the imposing man. "Yes, baby, that's him," Brianna replied quietly. "He looks mean," Grace said matter-of-factly. "Shh," Brianna hushed her, glancing around nervously. "You can't say things like that here." One by one, the cases were called. Brianna watched as people approached the bench, their voices trembling as they tried to explain themselves. Judge Evans listened intently, but rarely showed any emotion. His rulings were quick and firm, leaving no room for argument. Brianna's heart pounded every time the clerk called a new name, dreading the moment it would be her turn. Grace, oblivious to the tension, fidgeted beside her, drawing in her notebook and whispering questions about everything she saw. Finally, her name was called. "Brianna Taylor," the clerk announced, her voice echoing through the room. Brianna felt her legs go weak as she stood, clutching Grace's hand tightly. They walked to the front of the courtroom together, the eyes of the gallery following their every move. Brianna could feel the weight of their stares, their silent judgments. She stood before the judge, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of her dress. Grace stood beside her, looking up at the judge with wide, curious eyes. "Ms. Taylor, you're here regarding a parking violation," Judge Evans said, his deep voice filling the room. "Yes, Your Honor," Brianna replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please explain the circumstances," the judge said, his tone firm but not unkind. Brianna took a deep breath and began to explain. She told the judge about her broken-down car, her rush to get Grace's medication, and her desperation to make it to work on time. Her voice wavered as she described her financial struggles, her 2 jobs, and her constant fear of falling behind on rent. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cracking, "I'm not trying to make excuses. I know I shouldn't have parked there, but I didn't know what else to do. I was just trying to take care of my daughter." Judge Evans listened carefully, his expression unreadable. He flipped through her case file, his eyes scanning the pages without a hint of emotion. Brianna felt the silence stretching on for too long. Her stomach churned as she waited for his response. She had poured her heart out, but the judge's stoic demeanor gave her no indication of what he was thinking. "Ms. Taylor," he finally said, his voice even, "while I understand your circumstances, the law is the law. Parking in a restricted zone, especially a handicapped space, is a serious violation." Brianna's heart sank. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but blinked them away. She couldn't afford to cry here. "Do you have anything else to say in your defense?" the judge asked. Before Brianna could respond, Grace tugged on her sleeve. "Lawyer," Grace said loudly, her small voice cutting through the heavy silence. Brianna froze, her eyes widening in horror. "Grace, no," she whispered, but it was too late. "We're hungry," Grace declared, her voice clear and innocent. "Can we get something to eat?" The courtroom erupted in whispers and muffled laughter. Brianna's face turned bright red as she stared down at her daughter, mortified. Judge Evans raised a hand, silencing the room. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Grace. "What did you say, young lady?" he asked, his tone surprisingly calm. Brianna's heart pounded in her chest as she braced herself for what would happen next. A judge's curiosity. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Evans' gaze shifted from Grace to Brianna. His stern expression softened ever so slightly, though he maintained his air of authority. The murmurs in the gallery subsided, and all eyes were on the young girl who had disrupted the rigid order of the court. "What did you just say?" Judge Evans asked again, this time leaning forward slightly. His tone wasn't scolding, it carried a hint of curiosity. Brianna gripped Grace's shoulder, her heart racing. "Grace," she whispered, her voice strained. "That's enough." But Grace, in her innocent way, looked up at the judge and repeated herself clearly, without hesitation. "I said we're hungry. Mama didn't get breakfast, and I'm hungry too." The judge raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching as if he were suppressing a smile. It was the most unexpected thing anyone had seen in his courtroom, and for a moment the seriousness of the legal proceedings seemed to dissolve. "Hungry, you say?" Judge Evans asked, his deep voice filling the room. "Yes, sir," Grace replied, nodding earnestly. The judge leaned back in his chair, glancing at the papers in front of him. Then he did something that stunned everyone. Instead of ignoring Grace's outburst or reprimanding Brianna for bringing her daughter, he rested his elbows on the desk and clasped his hands together. "Tell me, young lady," he began, his tone shifting from stern to surprisingly gentle. "What's your favorite thing to eat?" Grace's eyes lit up, and she immediately blurted out, "Pizza! And burgers, too. But Mama says we can't have them a lot because we have to save money for rent." The courtroom grew quieter, the tension replaced with a sense of curiosity. Brianna felt her face flush as she stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. Judge Evans tilted his head, his sharp gaze softening further. "Is that so?" he asked, his eyes flickering to Brianna for a brief moment before returning to Grace. "And what's your favorite thing about your mama?" Grace didn't miss a beat. "She works really, really hard. She wakes up early and makes sure I get to school. She cooks dinner, even when she's really tired. And she tells me she loves me every night before I go to bed." The girl's voice was filled with pride, and her wide, innocent eyes seemed to reflect the unshakable admiration he had for his mother. Judge Evans nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "That's very kind of her," he said. "It sounds like your mom is a very special lady." "She is!" Grace exclaimed, beaming. "But sometimes she cries at night when she thinks I'm asleep." Brianna's breath hitched, and a hush fell over the room once more. She felt tears pricking the corners of her eyes, but quickly blinked them away, willing herself to stay composed. She couldn't afford to break down here, not in front of all these people. The judge shifted his gaze to Brianna, his eyes searching her face. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "is what your daughter says true?" Brianna hesitated, her throat tight. "Your Honor," she began carefully, her voice trembling. I try my best to take care of my daughter. Things aren't easy, but I do what I can." Judge Evans studied her for a moment longer before turning his attention back to Grace. "And how does it make you feel when you see your mama working so hard?" he asked. Grace's face scrunched up in thought before she answered. "I wish I could help her more. I try to be a good girl so she doesn't have to worry about me." The sincerity in her voice was visible, and Brianna felt her chest tighten. She wanted to hold her daughter, to shield her from the scrutiny of the courtroom and the judge's questions. But she also knew there was no stopping her now. For the first time in his long career, Judge Evans appeared caught off guard. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see what he would say or do next. "Ms. Taylor," the judge finally said, his tone softer than before, "I must admit, it's not often that I hear a child speak so openly in my courtroom. Your daughter is quite remarkable." "Thank you, Your Honor," Brianna replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at Grace again, his stern demeanor momentarily replaced with something resembling a faint smile. "Grace, I think we need to take care of that hunger problem first. Would you agree?" Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "Really?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement as she jumped around. Judge Evans nodded, turning to the bailiff. "Officer Daniels, would you please step out and bring back some food for our young guest here?" The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the bailiff exited through a side door. Brianna's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she also felt a flicker of relief. The judge's actions were unexpected, but they offered a brief reprieve from the tension that had gripped her since the moment she entered the courthouse. "Grace," the judge said, breaking the silence, "while we wait, can you tell me more about your mama? What's the hardest thing you've seen her do?" Grace thought for a moment, her little brow furrowed in concentration. "One time, she worked at night and still woke up early to take me to school," she said, "and she always makes sure I eat first, even if there's not a lot of food." The room grew still again, the weight of Grace's words hanging in the air. Brianna felt like the walls were closing in on her. Each detail her daughter revealed peeling back another layer of her private struggles. When the bailiff returned, he carried a brown paper bag and a small bottle of juice. He handed it to Grace, who accepted it eagerly, her face lighting up with excitement. "Thank you," Grace said, her voice cheerful as she tore into the bag. "You're welcome," the bailiff replied, his stern face softening for a moment. The judge watched as Grace took a bite of a sandwich, his small frame relaxing for the first time since entering the courtroom. "Better now?" Judge Evans asked. "Yes," Grace said between bites. Brianna wanted to melt into the floor. While she was grateful for the judge's kindness, she couldn't shake the feeling that her vulnerabilities had been put on display for everyone to see. "Ms. Taylor," the judge said, his tone turning serious again, "your daughter has given us a lot to think about today. It's clear that you've been working hard to provide for her, but it's also clear that you're struggling." Brianna nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The judge sighed, tapping his fingers on the desk. "I'm calling for a brief recess. During this time, I want you to sit down with Grace and take a moment to breathe. When we return, we'll discuss your case further." He banged his gavel, signaling the recess, and the gallery erupted into murmurs as people rose from their seats. Brianna felt a mix of emotions as she led Grace to a bench outside the courtroom. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing with questions. Why had the judge shown them this unexpected kindness? Was it genuine, or was it just a way to make her feel indebted? "Mama, this is the best sandwich ever!" Grace exclaimed, her face smeared with crumbs. Brianna managed a small smile, stroking her hair. "I'm glad, baby," she said, though her voice was heavy with worry. As they waited for the recess to end, Brianna couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. But for now, she held on to the faint glimmer of hope that Grace's innocent words had sparked something in the judge's heart. Brianna's story unfolds. The courtroom settled into an expectant hush as Judge Evans returned to his seat, gavel in hand. Brianna's heart raced as she and Grace took their places once again. The brief recess had provided only a fleeting sense of relief. Now, she felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on her, watching, waiting for her next move. "Court is back in session," Judge Evans announced, his voice steady but devoid of the warmth he had shown during the earlier exchange with Grace. The gavel came down with a decisive thud, silencing the whispers that still lingered among the gallery. Brianna swallowed hard. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. "Ms. Taylor," Judge Evans began, folding his hands in front of him. His tone was measured, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "Before we move forward, I'd like to hear more about your circumstances." You mentioned earlier that you're struggling to make ends meet. Please elaborate. Brianna felt her palms grow clammy. She glanced at Grace, who was quietly scribbling in her notebook, blissfully unaware of the enormity of the moment. Taking a deep breath, she looked up at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling. I've been trying my best to keep things together, but it's been hard. Really hard." "Start from the beginning," the judge said, leaning forward slightly. "Where are you from?" Brianna's mind drifted back to her childhood, the memories as vivid as if they had just happened yesterday. "I grew up in Vine City," she began. At the mention of the neighborhood, several heads in the courtroom nodded knowingly. Vine City, one of Atlanta's historically black neighborhoods, carried a legacy of resilience, but also a reputation for economic hardship. "My mom raised me and my younger brother, James, by herself," Brianna continued. "My dad left us when I was 8. One day, he just didn't come home." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "We didn't have much, but my mom worked so hard to make sure we were okay. She worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. Cleaning houses, waiting tables, whatever she could find." Judge Evans nodded, his expression unreadable. "And your father? Did he ever return?" Brianna shook her head. "No, sir. We never saw him again. It was just the 3 of us after that." The courtroom remained quiet, the audience captivated by Brianna's story. Even the usual shuffling and murmuring from the gallery had ceased. "What about your brother?" the judge asked. "Where is he now?" Brianna hesitated, a pang of guilt rising in her chest. James got into some trouble when he was younger. He's in prison now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Judge Evans tilted his head, his gaze softening slightly. "I see. And what about you? What path did you take after high school?" "I wanted to go to college," Brianna said quickly, her tone tinged with a mix of pride and regret. "I even got accepted to Georgia State, but—" She paused, her throat tightening. Life had other plans. The judge waited patiently, giving her the space to continue. "I met Darnell when I was 19, Brianna said, her eyes darting briefly to Grace. "He was charming, funny. I thought he was the one. We were together for a few years, and when I found out I was pregnant with Grace, I thought we'd start a family." "And did you?" Judge Evans asked, his voice even. Brianna let out a bitter laugh. "Not exactly. When Grace was 2, Darnell decided he wasn't ready to be a father. He left us without warning, just like my dad left my mom." The weight of those words hung in the air, and Brianna felt a lump rise in her throat. She fought to keep her composure, glancing at Grace to make sure she wasn't paying too much attention. Judge Evans' gaze lingered on Brianna for a moment before he spoke. "So, you've been raising your daughter on your own since then?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I've been doing everything I can to make sure she has what she needs, but it's not easy." The judge nodded slowly. "Tell me about your work situation. What do you do for a living?" "I have 2 jobs," Brianna explained. "In the mornings, I work as a waitress at a diner, and in the evenings, I clean offices downtown. Between the 2, I barely make enough to cover rent, groceries, and daycare for Grace. Do you receive any child support?" the judge asked. Brianna shook her head, her jaw tightening. "No, sir. Darnell disappeared. I've tried to track him down, but it's like he vanished." As Brianna continued, she felt the emotions she had buried for so long rising to the surface. "Some months, I have to choose between paying the rent and keeping the lights on," she admitted, her voice cracking. "And when Grace gets sick, which happens a lot because of her asthma, I have to figure out how to pay for her medication. There's never enough money to go around." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Asthma, you say? How severe is it?" "It's bad, Your Honor," Brianna said, her eyes filling with tears. "She's had attacks that scared me half to death. One time, I had to rush her to Grady Hospital in the middle of the night. I still owe them for that bill." Judge Evans nodded, his face still unreadable. "And how do you handle emergencies like that?" Brianna hesitated, her cheeks burning with shame. Sometimes I have to borrow money from payday lenders. I know it's a bad idea, but I don't have a choice." The judge sighed deeply, his fingers tapping against the desk. "Ms. Taylor, you've been through a lot," he said finally. "More than most people could handle." Brianna blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected acknowledgement. She had braced herself for judgment, for criticism, but not for understanding. "I'm just trying to do right by my daughter," she said softly. "She's all I've got." The judge glanced at Grace, who was now doodling quietly in her notebook, blissfully unaware of the heavy conversation taking place around her. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Evans leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Taylor," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality, "thank you for sharing your story. It's clear that you're doing everything in your power to provide for your daughter." "Thank you, Your Honor," Brianna said, her voice trembling with emotion. The judge glanced at the bailiff. "Let's take another brief recess," he announced, his tone firm. As the gavel came down, Brianna let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with a mix of relief and uncertainty. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, she felt like someone had truly heard her. A judge's revelation. When the court resumed, the atmosphere was notably different. Brianna could feel it in the air. The murmurs in the gallery had quieted, replaced by a kind of tension that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Even Judge Evans seemed more reflective as he adjusted his robe and took his seat. "All right," the judge said, his voice measured as he tapped his fingers on the desk. "Ms. Taylor, before we proceed with my decision, I want to share something. It's not something I do often, but I believe it's relevant here." Brianna froze, her breath catching in her throat. Grace looked up from his drawing, his big eyes fixed on the judge. Judge Evans took a deep breath and looked directly at Brianna. "You mentioned growing up in Vine City. I know that neighborhood well," he began, his voice steady, but tinged with emotion. "You see, I grew up there too." A ripple of surprise ran through the gallery. Several people leaned forward in their seats, whispering to one another. Judge Evans let the moment linger before continuing. "I was raised by a single mother, just like you," he said, his gaze unwavering. "My father left when I was 5 years old. My mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and working as a nurse's aide at night, to make sure my brother and I had food on the table. She never complained, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes every day." Brianna's heart clenched. She hadn't expected this kind of vulnerability from the stern judge who had seemed untouchable just moments ago. "The streets of Vine City weren't kind to us," the judge continued. "There were temptations everywhere. Drugs, gangs, easy money. I saw so many of my friends fall into those traps. But my mother, she never gave up on me. She made me promise her that I'd finish school and make something of myself." The judge's voice grew softer as he leaned forward slightly. "There was a teacher at my middle school, Mr. Hargrove. He saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. One day, after I got into trouble for skipping class, he pulled me aside. He told me, 'Marcus, you're too smart to throw your life away. You have a gift, and if you work hard, you can change your story.'" Judge Evans paused, his expression distant as if he were reliving the memory. "I didn't believe him at first, but he wouldn't let up. He tutored me after school, helped me apply for college scholarships, and even bought me my first suit for a debate competition. That one act of kindness, his belief in me, changed the trajectory of my life." The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the gallery, which had been a source of murmurs and movement all day, sat still. Brianna felt a lump in her throat as she listened, her own struggles flashing before her eyes. Judge Evans turned his attention back to her. "Ms. Taylor," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "your story reminds me of my mother's and your daughter. Well, Shabu reminds me of myself at that age. I see the same determination in you that I saw in her. You're doing everything you can to give your child a better life, and that's not something I take lightly." Brianna didn't know what to say. Her hands gripped the edge of the podium as she struggled to process his words. The judge straightened in his seat. With that in mind, I'm making a decision that I believe is just, he said, his voice carrying a weight of authority. I am dismissing the $400 parking fine. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. Brianna's knees felt weak, and she had to steady herself against the podium. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice shaking. But the judge wasn't finished. He held up a hand, signaling for silence. I'm not doing this because I believe the law should be ignored, he said firmly, but because I believe the law should also take into account the circumstances of those it serves. Penalizing someone who is already struggling doesn't create justice. It creates more hardship, and that's not what this court stands for. The gallery erupted in murmurs again, but Judge Evans quickly silenced them with a sharp tap of his gavel. Ms. Taylor, he said, his tone softening, I'd like to speak with you privately in my chambers. Officer Daniels will escort you. Brianna's eyes widened. Her mind raced with questions. Why would the judge want to speak with her privately? Was this a good sign or a bad one? She glanced at Grace, who was looking up at her with a mixture of curiosity and excitement. Grace can come with us, Judge Evans added, as if sensing her hesitation. Brianna nodded, her voice caught in her throat. The walk to the judge's chambers felt surreal. The hallway was quiet, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the polished floors. When they entered the room, Brianna was struck by how different it felt from the courtroom. The chambers were warm and inviting, with bookshelves lining the walls and a family photo on the desk. Please have a seat, Judge Evans said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. Brianna sat down cautiously, Grace climbing onto the seat beside her. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Ms. Taylor, I want to help you, he said simply. Brianna blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Help me? She echoed. Yes, the judge said, his tone sincere. I oversee a community fund here in Atlanta that's designed to assist single parents like yourself. It provides immediate financial aid for rent, groceries, and other necessities. I'd like to connect you with those resources. Tears welled up in Brianna's eye. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. That's not all, Judge Evans continued. I also have connections to several job training programs and childcare resources. Many of them are free or heavily subsidized. With the right support, I believe you can find a more stable situation for yourself and your daughter. Brianna's mind raced. It felt like a lifeline had been thrown her way, and she wasn't sure if she dared to grab it. Your Honor, I don't know what to say, she stammered. Say you'll accept the help, the judge said gently. No one should have to do this alone, Ms. Taylor, and you've done more than enough on your own. Brianna nodded, the tears spilling over now. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much. The judge smiled faintly, his stern demeanor softening. You remind me of my mother, he said again. And if there's one thing she taught me, it's that community is everything. Sometimes, all we need is for someone to believe in us. Grace, who had been quietly listening, looked up at the judge and grinned. Thank you for helping my mama, she said, her small voice filled with sincerity. The judge chuckled. You're very welcome, young lady. As Brianna and Grace left the chambers, escorted by Officer Daniels, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief and hope. For the first time in years, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, it didn't seem so bleak. Her journey wasn't over, but this moment, this act of kindness, was the beginning of something new. The morning after Brianna's court hearing, the streets of Atlanta were alive with a buzz that felt almost electric. Inside the modest apartment she shared with Grace, Brianna stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, the events of the previous day replaying in her mind like a film. She could hardly believe what had happened. The dismissal of her fine Judge Evans's words of encouragement and the resources he had offered her. It felt surreal, as if she had stepped into someone else's life for a moment. Across the table, Grace munched on a piece of toast, completely oblivious to the magnitude of their new reality. Mama, do you think the judge will want some of my drawings? He liked them yesterday, she said, grinning through a mouthful of bread. Brianna chuckled, shaking her head. I think he's got enough paperwork on his desk, baby, but maybe one day we can thank him properly. She glanced at her phone, which had been vibrating with notifications since late last night. Unbeknownst to her, the courtroom incident had caught the attention of a local journalist who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, observing the case. The journalist, a young woman named Simone Parker, had a knack for finding human interest stories that resonated deeply with Atlanta's diverse community. After witnessing the compassion Judge Evans had shown and hearing Brianna's heartfelt story, Simone knew this was a tale worth telling. By the time Brianna logged onto her phone, Simone's article was everywhere. The headline read, "Atlanta Judge Shows Unprecedented Kindness to Struggling Single Mother." The article detailed Brianna's struggles, Grace's innocent plea in the courtroom, and Judge Evans's heartfelt revelation about his own upbringing. Simone's words painted a vivid picture of hope and resilience, capturing the raw humanity of the moment. Within hours, the story had gone viral. Social media platforms lit up with shares and comments, many praising Judge Evans for his empathy and calling for systemic change within the court system. Brianna scrolled through the comments, her emotions a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "This is what justice should look like," one user had written. "Not punishment, but understanding. Judge Evans is a real one," another comment read. "This is the kind of leadership Atlanta needs." There were hundreds of messages like these, and Brianna felt overwhelmed. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, and part of her worried about what it might mean. Would people judge her for her struggles, or would they truly understand how hard she had been working to survive? As the morning wore on, the phone calls began. First, it was a representative from a local news station asking if Brianna would be willing to do an interview. Then came a call from her church, where the pastor had heard about the article and wanted to offer his support. "Brianna, we're so proud of you," Pastor Daniel said warmly. "You've inspired so many people. If there's anything the church can do to help, please don't hesitate to ask." Tears welled up in Brianna's eyes as she thanked him. She wasn't used to this outpouring of kindness, but it felt like a lifeline she had been waiting for her entire life. Meanwhile, Judge Evans' chambers were busier than ever. The story had not only drawn attention to Brianna, but also shone a spotlight on the judge himself. Reporters lined up outside the courthouse, eager to get a statement from the man who had shown compassion in a system often criticized for its rigidity. Judge Evans, however, remained focused on the bigger picture. Sitting at his desk, he reviewed case files while his assistant fielded calls from community leaders, nonprofit organizations, and even members of the city council. "What's the agenda for today?" he asked his assistant, a young man named Aaron. "3 interviews requested, sir. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution wants to do a piece on your upbringing, and the mayor's office called. They'd like to discuss potential reforms in the court system." Judge Evans sighed, removing his glasses. "Let's schedule the mayor's meeting for next week. As for the interviews, let's keep them brief. This isn't about me. It's about the people we're supposed to be serving." The judge's words resonated deeply, and his actions reflected them. He began drafting proposals for changes within the local court system. Among them were plans to implement payment plans for minor fines, allowing individuals to pay in installments instead of all at once. He also pushed for a community service alternative, where defendants could work off their fines through volunteer hours. "Justice should be accessible," he said during one of his interviews. "It shouldn't be a privilege reserved for those who can afford it." His proposals gained traction quickly, with several community leaders voicing their support. Activists who had long fought against systemic inequalities in Atlanta rallied around Judge Evans, seeing him as a rare ally within the judicial system. Brianna, on the other hand, found herself becoming an unexpected voice for struggling single mothers. Invitations poured in for her to speak at community events, share her story, and advocate for change. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something she had ever considered, but after a long conversation with Pastor Daniels, she decided to give it a try. The first event was held at a local community center. Brianna stood nervously behind the podium, gripping the edges tightly as she looked out at the crowd. Grace sat in the front row, giving her an encouraging thumbs up. "Good evening," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Brianna Taylor, and I'm just a mom trying to do my best." She spoke about her upbringing in Vine City, her struggles as a single mother, and the moment in the courtroom that changed everything. As she shared her story, she noticed heads nodding in the audience. People understood. They had been through similar battles. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Brianna felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. The ripple effect of the courtroom incident continued to grow. Local organizations reached out to offer assistance, providing everything from child care vouchers to job placement programs. A nearby church organized a fundraiser to help cover Brianna's overdue bills, raising more than enough to pay off her back rent and keep her electricity running. Atlanta's small businesses also got involved. A local grocery store offered Brianna a monthly stipend for groceries, while a car repair shop volunteered to fix her aging sedan free of charge. As the weeks went by, Brianna began to see tangible changes in her life. With the resources Judge Evans had provided and the support from her community, she was able to enroll in a job training program that promised better opportunities. Grace thrived in the new after-school program she attended, where she made new friends and discovered a love for chess. Through it all, Brianna remained humble, never forgetting where she came from or how far she had come. "This isn't just about me," she said during an interview with a local TV station. "There are so many people out there who are struggling just like I was. If my story can help shine a light on that, then it's all worth it." Judge Evans watched from the sidelines as the movement he had inadvertently sparked gained momentum. He attended a town hall meeting where residents shared their stories, many echoing Brianna's struggles. For the first time, he felt hopeful that real change was possible, not just within the court system, but within the entire city of Atlanta. By the end of the meeting, one thing was clear. Brianna's story was no longer just hers. It belonged to a community that was ready to rally together and demand better for everyone. A new chapter for Brianna. The days following Brianna's courtroom experience felt like stepping into a new life. For years, she had moved through her days weighed down by worry, trying to navigate the relentless challenges of single motherhood. But now, for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It began with a phone call from one of the job programs Judge Evans had mentioned during their conversation. The woman on the line, a caseworker named Ms. Harper, spoke with a warmth that immediately put Brianna at ease. "Brianna, we've reviewed your application," Ms. Harper said. "Based on your skills and experience, we'd like to offer you a spot in our career training program. It focuses on administrative roles in healthcare, and I think it could be a great fit for you." Brianna's breath caught. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Ms. Harper replied, her tone encouraging. "The program is fully funded, and it even includes childcare support while you complete your training." Brianna clutched the phone, tears springing to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." The program was demanding, but Brianna poured herself into it with the same determination she had always used to care for Grace. Classes were held at a training center in downtown Atlanta, just a short bus ride from her apartment. Every morning, she packed Grace's lunch and walked her to her new after-school program before heading to her classes. The program wasn't just about learning new skills. It was about rebuilding her confidence. Brianna had always been bright and resourceful, but years of struggle had dimmed her sense of self-worth. Now, as she mastered typing, scheduling, and other administrative tasks, she began to see herself in a new light. "Brianna, you're a natural," one of her instructors told her during a mock interview exercise. "You've got the professionalism and the drive that employers are looking for." Hearing those words felt like a lifeline. For so long, Brianna had doubted her own abilities. but now she was starting to believe in herself again. Meanwhile, Grace was thriving in her new routine. The after school program, run by a local nonprofit, offered everything from tutoring to recreational activities. Grace quickly became known for her boundless energy and infectious laughter, endearing herself to the staff and other kids. Mama, guess what I learned today? She asked one evening, her eyes shining with excitement. What's that, baby? Brianna asked as she stirred a pot of spaghetti. I learned how to play chess, Grace exclaimed. Mr. Brandon said I'm really good at it. Brianna smiled, ruffling her hair. That's amazing, Grace. I'm so proud of you. As she listened to her chatter about her day, Brianna felt a deep sense of gratitude. For so long, she had worried about whether she was giving Grace the childhood she deserved. Now, for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. After completing the training program, Brianna was offered a position as an administrative assistant at a small clinic in Atlanta. The job paid significantly more than her previous positions, and the hours were steady and manageable. On her first day, she stood in front of the clinic's glass doors, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. Dressed in a crisp blouse and slacks she had purchased with a gift card from one of the community programs, she felt like a different person. Good morning, Ms. Taylor. The receptionist greeted her warmly. We're so glad to have you on board. Thank you, Brianna replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. As she settled into her new role, Brianna found herself thriving in ways she hadn't expected. She quickly mastered the clinic's scheduling system, organized patient files with precision, and even offered suggestions to streamline some of the office processes. You're doing a fantastic job, Brianna, her supervisor told her one afternoon. You're a real asset to the team. Brianna beamed, her chest swelling with pride. For the first time in years, she felt secure, not just financially, but emotionally as well. The stability in her life allowed her to make another big change, moving to a new apartment. Through one of the resources Judge Evans had provided, Brianna qualified for a housing assistance program that helped her find a safe, affordable apartment closer to Grace's school. The day they moved in was filled with both exhaustion and joy. The new apartment wasn't fancy, but it was clean, bright, and felt like a fresh start. Look, Mama, Grace called as she ran into her new room. I have my own closet now. Brianna laughed, wiping sweat from her brow as she unpacked a box of dishes. That's right, baby. And you've got a bigger window, too. As they set up their new home, Brianna felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The stress and fear that had once dominated her days were beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that things were finally turning around. One Saturday afternoon, a few months after the move, Brianna found herself back at the community center where she had attended her first speaking event. This time, she was there as a volunteer, helping other single mothers navigate the same challenges she had faced. She sat at a folding table, guiding a young woman named Tasha through the process of applying for childcare assistance. Tasha's eyes were filled with the same mix of hope and exhaustion that Brianna had once seen in her own reflection. Thank you so much, Tasha said, her voice trembling with emotion. I didn't know where to start, but you've made this so much easier. Brianna reached across the table, giving her a reassuring smile. You're going to get through this, she said. It's hard, but you're stronger than you think, and you're not alone. Nearby, Grace played with a group of kids in the center's play area. She was teaching them how to play chess, her little hands moving the pieces with practiced precision. Checkmate, she announced triumphantly, grinning at her opponent. The room filled with laughter and applause, and Brianna couldn't help but smile as she watched her. Grace's innocence and optimism had been her guiding light through the darkest of times, and seeing her so happy felt like the greatest reward she could ever receive. As the day wound down, Brianna took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. The road had been long and filled with challenges, but she had persevered. And while she knew there would still be obstacles ahead, she also knew she had the strength and support to face them. The final words of Judge Evans echoed in her mind. Sometimes all we need is for someone to believe in us. Brianna had found that belief, not just from the judge, but from her community, her son, and most importantly, herself. Paying it forward. The months following Brianna's transformation brought unexpected blessings and new opportunities, but they also introduced her to a concept she hadn't fully understood before: the power of giving back. After years of struggling, she had learned how one act of kindness could create ripples that changed lives. Now Brianna wanted to be the one creating those ripples for others. It began with an idea she couldn't shake, a desire to do more for the single mothers she met at the community center. Though she was volunteering regularly, Brianna often encountered women who were overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of the systems they were trying to navigate. Applications for housing, childcare, job training, and food assistance all came with pages of requirements and bureaucratic hurdles. Sitting in her living room one night with Grace asleep in her room, Brianna pulled out a notebook and began to jot down ideas. Resource guides, she murmured to herself, scribbling furiously. Workshops for time management, a list of places that help with groceries. The more she wrote, the more the plan took shape. By the time she closed the notebook, she realized she was holding the blueprint for something much bigger than she had initially envisioned. A support group specifically for single mothers in Atlanta. The next day, Brianna met with Pastor Daniels at her church to pitch her idea. "Pastor, I know this might sound ambitious," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "but I think we need something more than just the community center. A group where single mothers can meet regularly, share resources, and support each other." Pastor Daniels leaned back in his chair, his hands folded thoughtfully. "Brianna, that doesn't sound ambitious. It sounds inspired," he said with a smile. "I think it's a wonderful idea. What do you need to get started?" Brianna blinked, surprised by his immediate enthusiasm. "Well, I'd need a space to hold meetings, and maybe some volunteers to help with childcare during the sessions." "Say no more," the pastor interrupted. "You can use one of the church halls, and I'll put the word out to our congregation. I'm sure we'll find plenty of volunteers." Brianna's chest swelled with gratitude. "Thank you, Pastor. This means so much to me." The first meeting of the group, which Brianna decided to call the Empowerment Circle, took place 2 weeks later. She wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe a handful of women would show up, maybe none. But as she set up chairs in the small church hall, women began to trickle in. There was Tasha, the young mother Brianna had helped at the community center, who brought her 2-year-old daughter along. There was Angela, a woman in her 40s who had just escaped an abusive marriage and was trying to rebuild her life. By the time the meeting started, there were over a dozen women in the room, each with a unique story and a shared determination to overcome their challenges. Brianna stood at the front of the room, her heart pounding. "Welcome, everyone," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "My name is Brianna Taylor, and I'm so glad you're here. This group is about more than just sharing resources. It's about building each other up and reminding ourselves that we're not alone." The room filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. Over the next hour, the women shared their stories, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. Brianna listened intently, taking notes and offering encouragement. By the end of the meeting, the energy in the room was electric. "I needed this," Angela said as she gathered her things to leave. "I didn't realize how much until now. Thank you, Brianna." Brianna smiled, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Word of the Empowerment Circle spread quickly. Within a month, the group had doubled in size, and Brianna found herself fielding calls from women across Atlanta who wanted to join. Some came for advice, others for community, but all left feeling more hopeful than when they arrived. One evening, after a particularly lively session, a young woman approached Brianna with tears in her eyes. "Miss Taylor, I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I was about to give up. I didn't think I could do this anymore. But hearing your story, It made me realize I'm stronger than I thought. Brianna hugged her tightly, her own eyes brimming with tears. You're strong, she said, and you're not alone. None of us are. As the empowerment circle grew, so did Brianna's vision for its future. She partnered with local nonprofits to bring in guest speakers who could offer practical advice on everything from budgeting to legal rights. She organized workshops where members could learn new skills and even set up a mentorship program pairing experienced mothers with those who were just starting their journeys. Grace, always eager to help, became a fixture at the meetings, entertaining the children with games and stories while their mothers focused on the sessions. Grace, you're a lifesaver, one woman said with a laugh as she picked up her toddler. Despite the demands of running the group, Brianna continued to excel at her job at the clinic. Her supervisor, noticing her leadership skills and dedication, offered her a promotion to office manager, a role that came with a higher salary and more responsibilities. Are you sure I'm ready for this? Brianna asked during the meeting where the offer was made. Brianna, you've been ready since the day you walked through these doors, her supervisor said. Accepting the promotion was another milestone in a year that had already been filled with so many. It wasn't just a job, it was a symbol of how far she had come. The final piece of Brianna's transformation came one Sunday afternoon during an event organized by the Empowerment Circle. The group had decided to host a fundraiser to support single mothers who were at risk of eviction. Held in the church's main hall, the event featured live music, food donated by local restaurants, and a silent auction. Brianna stood at the podium addressing the crowd of attendees. When I started this group, I never imagined it would grow into something like this, she said, her voice strong and confident. This isn't just about me or any one person. It's about all of us coming together to lift each other up. Because when we support each other, we all rise. The applause was thunderous, and Brianna felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was her community, her family, and she was proud to be part of something so much bigger than herself. As the event wound down, Brianna spotted a familiar face in the crowd, Judge Evans. He had come quietly, without fanfare, to show his support. You've done well, Ms. Taylor, he said, shaking her hand warmly. Thank you, Your Honor, Brianna replied, her voice thick with gratitude. No, the judge said, his expression serious. Thank you. You've turned a moment of kindness into a movement. That's something to be proud of. Later that evening, as Brianna sat on her couch with Grace curled up beside her, she reflected on how far they had come. Her life wasn't perfect, and there would always be challenges, but she had learned that with determination, community, and a little kindness, anything was possible. Looking at Grace's peaceful face, she whispered, "We're going to be okay, baby. We're going to be just fine." And for the first time in a long time, she believed it with all her heart. If this story of courage and kindness inspired you, let us know by hitting that like button and sharing your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Brianna's shoes? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about resilience and the power of honesty. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.